Welcome everybody to York on a rainy day today. My name is Professor Kate Fleming. I'm Professor of Hospice Practice and Evidence Synthesis in the Department of Health Sciences at the University of York. And I also work at Hospice UK, which is a national charity for hospices, as their head of research and clinical innovation a couple of days a week. So I've got a huge interest in this area and I'm absolutely fascinated to listen to you talk today. But very much welcome to the York Festival of Ideas, and a huge welcome to our speaker today, Madeleine Bunting. For 25 years, Madeleine was a journalist at The Guardian and held a number of positions, including columnist from 1999 to 2012. She wrote on a wide range of subjects, including politics, social affairs, faith, and global development. Her previous books include Love of Country, which was shortlisted for the Wainwright and the Saltaire Prizes in 2017. The Plot, which won the Portico Prize in 2010 and was shortlisted for the Royal Society of Literature's On Dark J Prize. Her first novel, Island Song, won the Waverton Goodread Award in 2020. So quite a pedigree there, Madeleine. Welcome. And this afternoon, you'll be talking about your book, Labours of Love, The Crisis of Care, which as a nurse, I'm absolutely have been fascinated to read. So over to you.
Thank you so much, Kate. That's lovely to be in conversation with you, given your immense expertise. And also just very briefly, right at the beginning, to say that nursing turned out to be one of the most fascinating areas of research in the 5 years I spent looking at care. I think no other profession quite encapsulates all the complicated paradoxes and societal cultural understandings of care. Nursing, it seems to me, has repeatedly had to accommodate the kind of contradictions that are built into our culture and society around care. So it's particularly interesting, I think, talking to professors of nursing, as I've now been doing, about the book, about what my perceptions and point of view were. So I'm going to just start by just explaining a little bit about why did I decide to do this book, and how did I decide to do the book? What was my approach to it, and what were some of the key findings that came out of it? So I spent something like 5 years crisscrossing the country, shadowing, observing, interviewing, talking to all sorts of people who regard what they were doing as care. And that meant that I went back and forth over that big divide, paid and unpaid. We have all sorts of care which is professionalized and institutionalized. And then on the other hand, we have all this care that's very intimate and wrapped up in deep family relationships and intimacy. And I was really trying to pull down all the barricades, if you like, because I wanted to see, what commonalities are there right across the whole kind of waterfront. From the most prestigious jobs, such as a GP, that have this very, very kind of clearly articulated understanding of care, right through to a healthcare assistant or a domiciliary worker who's rushing in and out of homes on kind of quarter an hour visits under enormous pressure and very low paid and on 0 hours. So I think there were people often ask me, why did you get into this? And I think there were two main prompts. One was that as a journalist, as you mentioned on The Guardian, I wrote about care fairly often. And as a columnist, I found myself coming back again and again to the same sort of narrative framework, if you like, of what was going on, which was scandal, abuse, outrage, reform is needed. One of the things that you do as a Guardian leader writer is you get into a routine. You've got to kind of summarize in 400 words, that day's major story. And it was beginning to sound a bit repetitive, where I was rattling off, what needed to happen on a whole range of subjects, which came under the kind of care umbrella, whether that was social care or within healthcare. And I decided what I wanted to do was really sort of step back and try and see a bigger framing for this kind of political quagmire that we kept on talking about reform and nothing happened. And so ask some quite sort of fundamental questions about what do we think care is, and how do we think it's done? How do you train? How do you encourage people to become carers or to do care? And the other side of this, the other kind of prompt, if you like, was a kind of reckoning that people were very happy to ask me about my career. You know, what have you been doing, and what is your work? They were much less happy or much less interested in learning about what had probably taken up 3/4 of my time in the previous 3 decades, which was actually caring for other people, my children, my parents, other elderly relatives, the sense in which most women get to a point in their life and they realize that care has become absolutely sort of integral to every single day. They are supporting and nurturing the well-being of other people. I mean, it's something like a 50-50 chance by the time you get to your early 60s as a woman that you will be a major carer for somebody. And the hours that are being put in by women in their 60s and 70s are enormous. I mean, this is the whole area of informal care, as the unpaid sector gets described by the policy experts. Informal care, why it gets called formal and informal. I mean, you know, one of the things you'll have picked up in the book, Kate, is I keep on questioning the language we use. And I could have questioned that one, you know, because informal care, when you're spending maybe 70, 80 hours a week, I mean, it's quite an astonishing thing that you can actually face the biggest challenges about being a carer in the latter part of your life, when perhaps a partner has a stroke, or an elderly parent is very disabled. The kind of intensification of care can be quite acute, and certainly with terminal illness, which is obviously your area of expertise, you'll know how carers can suddenly be catapulted, and this can of course happen at any stage of your life. You can be catapulted into this intense period of providing care, and you know, that may be 6 months or it may be 5 years. Cancer and the way it goes in and out of remission creates this very, very long period of requiring care. So I was interested in kind of what the word means, what we understand by it. I was also interested in the history of it. So you'll have seen, Kate, that in every chapter I do a bit of a sort of quick deep dive. You know, what is the history of care? What are the kind of romantic notions that we have kind of got somewhere in our kind of heads, that somewhere along the line there was some sort of perfect golden age when all of, for example, one of the golden ages that often gets referred to by politicians is, you know, families just need to look after themselves. You know, it's all about the family stepping up. And, you know, with this kind of aging demographics, we just need families to step up. Well, you know, unpicking some of the history of that, I think, is really, really important. Actually, the history of care of the elderly has always been shambolic in this country, embarrassingly shambolic. And the family actually often hasn't either been able to or not wanted to step up to it. So you know, the book combines history, the kind of philosophy of care, the sociology of care, the anthropology of care. You know, I'm afraid I'm one of those writers that goes trampling over every academic boundary between the disciplines, and I'm a bit like a magpie, I'm afraid. You know, I kind of trespass all over everybody's patch, and then you sort of mix it all together with the interviews that I did, and this was about a kind of oral history of where people were describing to me what they thought they did and why they did it, and the kind of inspirations on them and the influences on them about how they cared. And out of all of that, I came up with a thesis, because I choose the word crisis very, very carefully. I'm not just picking it because it's alliterative with care, and I'm not just picking it because I'm a former journalist, and of course everything for a journalist is a crisis. That's the way you get your headlines. But I do think that we have reached a very uncomfortable place, which we're not very honest about acknowledging, which is that given that historically care has been regarded as women's work, women were expected to do the care, and they were expected to do it either cheaply or free. And many of the structures of kind of our society's sort of socialization of women was to ensure that supply of care was there, and it was provided both as a wife, a daughter, a mother, at a great sort of self-sacrifice, in this greatly sort of self-sacrificial way. And when they weren't available, servants were. I mean, one of the kind of historical histories, the sort of historical accounts that I thought was really important to put into this was servants. It was the biggest source of female employment right up until the 1930s. That's relatively recent. So a huge bulk of the care of our society historically has been done by servants. But the question is now we've reached a point where, of course, that supply of servants does not exist. You know, that kind of cheap labor is no longer available except to just the sort of super rich. Women's aspirations have changed dramatically. We have unprecedented levels of women in paid employment. So that classic sort of generational cycle whereby women had their children, looked after their children, and then began looking after their grandchildren or doing voluntary work in their 50s and 60s. Well, many of those women are still in the labour market working very hard. They don't have the spare time. And also they don't necessarily live near their family. So if you have geographical mobility built into your kind of understanding of how the economy should work, people need to move to where the jobs are. Well, then one of the costs of that will be to care networks of care, which are often so grounded in neighborhoods and in extended families staying in one place. So care has been, if you like, many of the traditional structures of care have been dismantled or weakened. And at the same time, we are observing where the gaps emerge. And I focus on particularly two gaps, but I think you can sort of see the threadbare nature of care at many, many points in our kind of in our lives. But I think it's particularly acute in childcare and in care of the elderly at the end of life because of the aging demographics. So we know our society is getting older. We know people are living longer, and that the proportion of people over 80, over 85 in extreme old age who are very frail and have a constant, quite complex requirements to be in and out of hospitals or medical appointments. You know, caring for that kind of old age is really complicated and time consuming. And we haven't really invested in the infrastructure or kind of, well, how do we do these long lives? You know, we've invested enormous amounts in medical advances to ensure that life expectancy has lengthened, which is a terrific achievement. But we haven't matched that with an understanding of, okay, so we've got all these extra years. What do they look like? How do we ensure that that they don't lead to extended period of loneliness and suffering and acute anxiety? And I know I assume that has played a part in the kind of work that you do with Hospice UK, because you know, my husband works in a hospice, and you know, I've heard a lot about sort of hospice policy and so forth, and I know that this is a really, really acute area. So I think my kind of question in the book is to what I hoped was that I would get the reader to be curious. That was the first starting point. What do I really think care is about? And to get them to just begin to think and dismantle some of their assumptions, maybe some of their prejudices. And so that's why the book has a number of different ways of just trying to provoke people into thinking again about what they understand care to be, and at the same time to lay out the kind of some of the dimensions of this crisis. I mean, you know, it's a huge subject, and I'm just pointing to certain aspects of it, if you like, because care in the end, you know, we're all dependent on frequent instances of care that are kind of woven into our daily lives. And I think it was very interesting. I was just finishing this book, and this is where I'll sort of end my first comments, but I was just finishing this book as the pandemic started. And there was me having written a book about the marginalization and cultural undervaluing of care, just as everybody was on their doorsteps clapping for carers. It was the most sort of uncanny moment. I thought for 5 years, I've been trying to sort of wrestle with this big cultural question about the undervaluing of care. Could this be the sort of paradigm shift? Could this moment really move things and dramatically change our understanding of care? And that's the sort of, you know, a year on, people are obviously are slightly less kind of you know, what was the word? I think they were struck by a deep sense of appreciation for the way some people were still going out to work at the risk of their own health to ensure that we were all getting fed, that rubbish was getting cleared off the streets, that people were being cared for in hospitals. And I hope the memory of that can last. I hope that that's something we can build on. But perhaps we can both talk about our hopes on that front at some point.
That's absolutely fascinating, Madeleine, and a real privilege of an insight into kind of what was behind the writing. So I've had the privilege of reading your book, but hearing what was behind the writing and kind of your motivation for doing it was absolutely fascinating. Thank you. And I think, yeah, we can reflect on that sort of a year later, and you know, possibly in the week in which one of the nurses who looked after Boris Johnson has resigned to be, and actually, you know, has that thought and respect for carers. My sense is in the general population, it's continued, whether it's held politically, with pay, you know, the lack of pay rise and all the rest of it's happened subsequently. It just feels like perhaps it hasn't, but maybe we can come back to that towards the end. You know, I was really sort of with a nursing background, and having had my mum who was a nurse as well, and having inherited her textbooks from the 1950s, absolutely intrigued by your observation of the change of the use of the word care over the years, and how everything now seems to have, you know, from the dry cleaning service van that says we care for your clothes, you know, without how actually very early on caring, and certainly in the first half of the 20th century, that care wasn't a word that was used so much. I don't know if you want to comment a little bit more on that.
Yeah, I mean, I would be very interested to know what the language was of your mum's textbooks. I suspect service came up quite a lot.
Yep, and what was quite interesting when I dived into them, so that was 1950. One of the particular ones I looked at was Pearce's General Textbook of Nursing, and it talked about nursing of people, but care of parts of people. So an example would be care of the hair, care of the mouth. But the final chapter that I looked at, naturally because of my professional background, was nursing the dying person and care of the dead body was the title of the final chapter. And I thought that was just fascinating, that nursing was a thing, but care wasn't. Care was of something, or of almost an inanimate part of a person, so now we very much talk about holistic care and care of the entire person, and particularly in palliative care, it's, you know, we look after the entire person and their family and those close to them, etc. So much less than the kind of reductionist, well, we're here to fix the leg in bed 10, which hopefully that language has gone. So for me, it was just fascinating that nursing was the term that was used to kind of denote care, but care was a term that was used to denote looking after a particular thing. So it really struck me, and it was something I hadn't picked up on before.
It's really interesting. I'm trying to work out quite what that distinction was, but it's fascinating, really, really fascinating. I can't quite think what the distinction is. But yeah, I suspect the language has shifted really significantly from those kinds of textbooks. I mean, yeah, I'm very tempted to start interviewing you, Kate.
Feel free. We saw this very much as a conversation, so I'm very happy to be asked questions as well. But I think maybe some of the shift is that, you know, nursing was seen as a vocation, not as a profession, not as something that actually required a degree. And certainly I did a nursing degree back in the mid-80s, when there was about 6 universities doing them, and spent my entire university experience kind of justifying why I was doing a degree. And you talk in the book, and you interviewed various nursing professors about, you know, too posh to wash, too clever to care. These are all the comments that come up, and the notion of being too clever to care is not one that's ever kind of given to doctors, or perhaps physiotherapists or occupational therapists or social work, all these professions that have needed a degree. And it's only really in the last 20 years that it's kind of shifted much more to nursing being an all-graduate profession. And the notion that therefore you may be too clever to care is one that, as you can imagine, greatly irks me, that the two are not mutually exclusive. But also you talk about that shift in basic sort of what were nursing roles, and certainly what would have been in the 50s of that whole care of the person actually being shifted away from the nursing role, and actually nurses are much more technical and leadership and all of that. And actually another term I really despise is basic care, because I think no care is basic. It's the meeting the fundamental needs of the human being when you're washing that individual and helping them to eat and support life essentially through that. But that care notion, and you talked already of the care worker who has 15 minutes to do the tasks and then retreat from the home. And so this whole shift in care that's happened as well, from it being kind of almost of the highest order to being the lowest order, but equally was it of the highest order when it was something that came to be with servants. There's so much to unpick there, so I kind of rambled there.
I'm like, God, there's so many things you could say on that one.
Yeah.
I mean, the first thing I would say is that I think that care is kind of riddled with various sort of dualisms, that our culture sees care in a very sort of specific way. And to just point out that dualism, too clever to care. So basically the way our kind of culture has understood this, and this is, deep historical roots to this, is that you're either highly intelligent or you're, very good-hearted. And the idea that you could be both, or that there could be a way of integrating both, seems to be very, very challenging. And another example of the dualism is the head, heart, hand thing. I mean, I know it's not dualism, that's, three different things, but it's definitely categorizing things. And it frustrated me somewhat that a book came out in the autumn about head, hand, and heart. And yet again, somehow it was regarded these categories did actually make sense. That it's quite, but the idea that nursing is a job which absolutely involves head and heart, and actually, of course, hands. So it's neither predominantly one thing or the other. And it's interesting because, of course, GPs, the GPs I interviewed would say they were definitely head, hand, and heart, and they understood exactly the role that all those three different things that they play. That there are moments when touch is incredibly important, and understanding the boundaries and the sensitivity around touch. When is it appropriate to put a hand on a forearm because somebody is utterly distraught and they need comfort? When is it appropriate that you're doing an examination and the way you touch a body will communicate the respect and the sensitivity of that? So it seems to me that all medical care involves all three: head, hand, and heart. So that's just one instance of where nursing has got kind of boxed into one place, and and I think one of the problems is this sort of history of nursing has contributed to that boxing. So if you go back into sort of pre-Florence Nightingale, it was someone almost on a status with servants who were working in the very, very early hospitals. The use of alcohol was rife as a way of dealing with the emotional distress, and the conditions, of course, were often quite bad. In the hospital, there was very little they could do, and people dreaded going to hospital. I mean, that's not where you went if you were ill. If you possibly could, you stayed at home, and if you were well enough, rich enough, you obviously had care in your home, often again coming from servants. And then along comes Florence Nightingale. I mean, I think this history is all still so relevant. That's what's so interesting, Kate, that you can see the marks on the profession of this history, because Florence Nightingale, complete genius. I think she's an absolutely fascinating character, because she looked at the sort of constraints of her time and decided you could make a totally respectable profession for women who needed a job, but you had to do it within the constraints of Christianity. So you had to make them very self-sacrificial, utterly virtuous, and you just said they were going to be called sisters. So you immediately set them up as kind of nun-type figures, which of course was intentional. That's exactly what Florence Nightingale, if women were going to be caring for the naked bodies of men and of course women, but particularly men was their anxiety, then you had to impose this astonishing kind of virtuous ideal onto them. But anyway, I kind of feel like I'm saying things to you, Kate, that you know all too well. But but coming from somebody who hasn't been steeped in that history for sort of 20, 30 years and approaching it, just thinking that this is really the kind of feminist story par excellence about women's struggle for financial independence when, respectable women who had no way of earning a living, Florence Nightingale was opening a door for them in a very, very significant way. But of course, the cost was that they could never really expect to be paid properly. They got an income, but not very much of one. So nursing, they talk about the gilded cage, don't they? That nursing has been struggling to kind of break out of this gilded cage ever since. The reason why this is all so relevant now is because for the last year, nursing has been struggling inside that gilded cage where Boris Johnson, for example, absolutely classic. It's classic. Boris says, wonderful, wonderful nurses. I, list them all by their names and they're all angels. And I'm so, so grateful to all of them. But he's not going to lift a finger to make sure that they get a proper pay deal. So it's still the old bind, which is, we think nurses are absolutely amazing and we love them to bits and we send them, cards and give them boxes of chocolates. But actually, they don't, people still struggle to think, do they really need to be paid properly? We can surely kind of cut a few corners on nursing, the cost of nursing salaries. Yeah, I wonder when that will change. I think it's something to do with still having a largely, a class of male politicians, which are still largely men who have been still, disproportionately influential over health policy. I mean, I know we've had obviously female health secretaries, but it's still a lot of men. If you look back over the last 30 years, I should think it's, it's probably more men than women.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. But what's quite interesting out of that is actually so the recruitment cycle through UCAS, through University's Central Admission Service, closed in January. And for nursing, pretty much across the country, we're up 40 to 50% on applications, and we were year on year. So there's been a real kind of bubble effect of people wanting to come into the profession on the back of, which we can only presume is on the back of the pandemic. And you sit there and think, well, never has healthcare been so at the forefront of the news day in, day out. Nor though has kind of the incidence of death. We don't normally talk about death and dying, but actually that's been absolutely at the forefront. Every day still we're getting data on numbers of deaths and total numbers of deaths and number of cases. So against that backdrop, and a really quite a stark backdrop as well, we're now getting an increase of people wanting to come into the profession, which is fantastic.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
What's the gender breakdown of that?
This is still very much, we have male nursing students, there are fewer male midwives, but they're still kind of very much in the minority. It's something that we do try and work and change, but yeah, we still have far more women applying than we do men.
That's very, very heartening. I mean, I wonder whether part of it is just that at a point of kind of national crisis, as we've been through in the last 15 months, one really does go through a process of reckoning as to what really, really matters in terms of sort of purpose and meaning in life. And I just wonder whether, nursing is one of those jobs where you have or can have a huge sense of meaning, because you are really, really connecting to people at a very deep level at a moment of acute vulnerability in their lives. But and maybe it's that sort of search for meaning. I did sort of refer to this slightly towards the end of the book, I'm much heartened by that.
Yeah, we were surprised, but equally heartened, and it means that actually, you know, the profession will be very strong going forward, and hoping that this continues, and it enables us to pick really good applicants
Yeah,
as well.
yeah,
And the pool
exactly.
is so much bigger,
Yeah.
which is brilliant for everybody, and for, you know, the people we're choosing now are those nurses who'll be caring for us in our older age. So I've got a vested interest in them
Yeah,
being good, really.
that's right. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Absolutely. So thinking about all the people you met across the book and that you interviewed, is there one that struck you or stayed closest or had the most profound impact on you? There's one that struck me that sounded like it had a profound impact on you, and I'll come to that. I'll see what you answer, and then I'll say the one that jumped out at me.
Well, it's quite hard. I mean, because the interviews are very intense. So I think I really, really engaged with people at a very, deep level. And I then spent a lot of time thinking about what they'd said when I was transcribing the interviews. So I would say, they're all pretty, a lot of them are very, very kind of clear in my head. Um, I mean, I think I found the chapter researching parents of kids with special needs and
Mm.
disability. Some of those interviews were almost unbearable to keep sort of listening. Uh, I do think that is an area of acute need. I mean, I talked about the most obvious kind of fraying of the social fabric at either ends of the lifespan, but and they affect sort of almost everyone. That's why we've all got a stake in this. But in terms of where perhaps some of the most acute shortfall is in that minority of people who have kids with special needs, and the struggle of their parents was just unbearable to listen to, and the lack of support um, from a wider society is, profoundly troubling. But the home care workers that I interviewed have got a special place in my heart, because they were such an amazing bunch of characters, and they were all so different, from a 21-year-old who had been a beauty therapist right through to a guy who'd run a maintenance company for sort of 20, 30 years, and who'd gone into home care because he didn't want to be sitting at home twiddling his thumbs, and discovered he absolutely loved it. So I'm not going to give you one person, I don't think, Kate. So now I'm really intrigued. Who have you got in mind?
So it was a group. It was that you wrote, and I could just imagine the situation really.
I know now who you're talking about.
Yeah, so it was some unqualified carers who were having some instruction by their line manager. They were all brought in today, and you write of them being of individuals who were kind of on their own in that meeting because they didn't know the other people, because obviously they all kind of go in and care at separate times. They probably know each other's names, but we're caring for a gentleman called Mike who was living with motor neuron disease, which had got to the point at which he may choke to death during their visit. And I think it's the stark way that you describe the absolute shock on their faces of basically unqualified carers who would have to deal with a situation that the most qualified of health professionals would find challenging, and that this was kind of being laid out to them in a meeting by their line manager as something they might just have to deal with on one of their visits. And then you've got that kind of lottery of, well, is that my visit? And you describe somebody kind of in tears, and it was such a stark situation that they were in, that will be being played out X number of times, not necessarily that situation, but other kind of really at the edge situations that can acutely happen when somebody's living with a life-limiting condition, that somebody who's unqualified, who's on kind of minimum wage or maybe a 0 hours contract, will have to encounter. And that kind of thing scares me. and I've got years of experience, because you have, but equally you have years of professional experience and a professional training to draw on. So that was what struck me, and I don't know if you want to further comment on that.
Yeah, well, yeah, that was a very, very, very painful moment, and I think you know, I thought, obviously, I thought a lot about what made their situation so difficult. And it was partly the lack of kind of sort of team support, the fact that they didn't know anyone, the fact that in this meeting, they were all strangers effectively. The people that they knew was the patient or client, you know, and his family. So it combined a sort of attachment of some form to the family. I mean, they had come to know them very well. This man was very, very sick. So they were going in, carers were going in like 4 times a day at this point. So they'd all got to know the couple very, very well. But they, you know, it was like who cares for the carers is really the question that was in that room, sort of unspoken. And the person who was giving them the briefing was a community nurse, and he was deeply concerned about it. And he knew exactly what he was sort of trying to prepare them for, and that it can be very, very traumatic and very upsetting. But I thought also culturally there was no context for this. I felt that it wasn't just the kind of organizational sort of gap, but the way in which our society doesn't deal with dying and death, and therefore there was no social support. You know, I kind of imagined their families, trying to imagine what it would be like to go home at the end of a shift in which, you know, the patient might have died very traumatically. What support would they have from their families or their friends, or would people be even prepared to listen? And it was that sort of sense about, you know, how do we support those who support the dying? And actually, since writing the book, I was very involved in the death of my aunt back in February, and I was on the other side of the process insofar as you know, the carers came and went, and my goodness me, how important those carers were. I mean, there was one moment when I was looking after my aunt because my cousin was out, and the telephone goes, and it was the district nurse. And she was very sort of bright and cheery, and her voice just sort of really kind of like, whoa, gosh, you know, went, morning. Now, is there anything you need from me? And, you know, I had no idea. I mean, I didn't know what we needed from her. So all I could say was, well, I don't know. And then in contrast, so she was the one that was qualified, right? She was a district nurse. Then the carer, who had been one of the main carers, who was totally unqualified, but she did some of the sleeping over for the night. She knew exactly what to do. Absolutely amazing. I mean, I'm in tears just remembering now how she came in on her day off to check, because she'd formed such a close bond with my aunt. And my aunt was just, you know, her face was just transformed to see this carer. And then she had to have minor operation, so that meant she couldn't work. So she still came in with her foot in plaster. She wasn't working, but she said she wanted to visit, and then she turned up at the funeral. And so the problem here, Kate, is it's not just about training. It's complicated, isn't it? That was somebody who did not have a lot of training, I suspect. I mean, she was doing the nights, so I suspect that's a pretty low standard of qualification. And yet, you know, but John Berger has this great phrase in this terrific book that I quote, A Fortunate Man, that wonderful kind of portrayal of a GP in the 1950s. And he talks about this concept of a familiar of death. The idea that there is somebody in the community who knows how it works, who's been there before, and for whom death is not frightening. That's probably about, you know, it's that sort of basic, except it's not remotely basic. It's someone who is not panicked by death and just can calmly take it in their stride, and knows therefore what kind of emotional support might be needed, what practical support. And I was interviewing a nurse actually who was working on a hospice, and she said how she and her husband, he was a doctor, were always getting called up by friends or neighbours or friends of friends of friends. And basically she's a familiar of death. So people know that. They know that they can talk to her and she's not going to collapse in floods of tears and get really embarrassed or not know what to say. That she can say, oh, okay, so they haven't got long now. It could be the next 2 weeks. You know, these kinds of things scare so many people.
And I'm very familiar with that kind of conversation you're talking about, because people don't worry talking to you about that because they know that you can handle it. So I have those kind of conversations with all sorts of different people, but it's because you know, death, which used to be such a part of society and everyday life, and, you know, extended families, somebody would die, they would, in the Victorian era, you know, they would stay at home, that their young children would be kind of wandering around the body. There was no mystery around it. It was just death was part of life. Death is still part of life, but it has been much more hidden away. It moved into that medicalized world of the hospital. Dying then happened, people on their own inside rooms, on a ward, perhaps unattended, and then slowly but surely, Dame Cicely Saunders developed the modern hospice movement, changed the face of care, but still it's something that is out with kind of routine, normal society. And I would say it has been out with until the last year, and kind of referring back to how much death has been talked about, and case studies of families on the news, and of people who 2 or 3 members of the family have died from COVID, and also the impact on that on people such as funeral directors, and throughout the whole system, really. Actually, kind of when we have such an increased death rate as we have seen over the last year, how that impacts on the broadest part of society. So that familiarity has come back, but I do wonder if it's kind of now got reduced again to those figures on the telly again, and it's not that we talk about it so much. And certainly there's lots of kind of bereavement support lines been set up, and lots of ways of trying to help people manage their bereavement, and particularly when that bereavement will have happened, somebody will have died, they will probably have been distanced from the person who's died because of visiting restrictions and all of that stuff that we've seen unfold over the last year, and how that will then impact on bereavement for people who may have not been you know, you talked earlier of caring can come at any point of your life and when you least expect it. And I think that's what COVID has done with regard to people who've died who would not have been expected to die at this stage of their life. Yeah,
you're absolutely right. That and I also think the other dimension of that is so many people with long COVID.
mm-hmm.
And you know, a lot of people will find themselves in one way or another, and it could just be doing the shopping for somebody or something, or right through to having to really do an enormous amount of looking after them. But you know, a lot of people will be finding themselves suddenly having to care for somebody struggling with long COVID. So and you know, it's interesting just sort of playing with that kind of concept, because I think one of the issues that sort of bobs about throughout the book is this idea around dependence and independence, and how care has been culturally undervalued. I think in part because it's so bound up with the experience of dependence, which is regarded as undesirable. The important thing in in life is to be independent. And you'll have seen about how much of the policy work around the elderly is about how do we keep them as independent as possible, as long as possible. You know, it's on and on and on. It's all about independence, as if we've got to try and shrink the amount of dependence in human life to its barest minimum. Okay, children, you can't make them independent, you know, so you've got to look after them, but after that everybody else needs to be independent. Well, you know, I think that's a really problematic sort of paradigm to have in society, because there are lots and lots of people that are dependent for a whole range of reasons in very obvious ways. So do we stigmatize them for their dependence? I mean, I was involved in a conversation on Saturday with a fabulous project in Hastings called Project Artworks, which has just been shortlisted for the Turner Prize, where a number of neurodivergent artists work together. And the woman that set it up, her son is now 38 with a wide range of special needs. And she was saying, does that make him less of a human being, that he is dependent and requires a really complex 24/7 regime of care to ensure that he's okay? And I think that issue of dependence is one that really interests me, because in terms of long COVID, you know, will we remember that these are people who, through no fault of their own, caught a horrible illness and have long-term consequences? Or will we start falling back into that that kind of language that has dogged welfare policy for the last 30 years, which is around blame and, you know, people malingering and, you know, trying to kind of, you know, get money off the state, etc., etc. You know, and I do think this is about dependence, and it's about our refusal to accept what is an essential part of human existence, which is that actually we're all dependent. It's just the extent to which we're prepared to acknowledge it, or the extent to which, you know, I'm dependent on my husband for all sorts of things. If I didn't have my husband cooking for me, I think most of my food would be burnt. So you know, that sort of recognition of interdependence, and that it's a complete sort of chimera, the idea of independence. That independence, I think, does us all a disservice. That acknowledging the ways in which we support each other is a much more kind of fruitful way of kind of moving forward. And of course, that's what clapping on the doorstep was in part about, was recognizing that interdependence for that you know, few months that we were doing it. Let's hope we haven't completely forgotten.
Yeah, and I think that the thought, your kind of acknowledgement around, actually, you know, we seek to minimize dependence as far as we can, and there's lots in healthcare policy around self-management of long-term conditions, but so often it isn't about self-management, it's about supported management of other people working with you. And it's very rare that an individual is doing it entirely on their own. Commonly there's a partner or a daughter or a, you know, somebody else helping alongside too. And actually that both of those people need to therefore be involved in that management of that long-term condition. And we, you know, these terms, management, and kind of the power that implies, but and the role of carers within that so often gets lost. But I think long COVID is going to be something that, if as it plays out, we're going to see more people in those caring roles that who are helping to support the management of a long-term condition that hadn't ever anticipated that was something that was going to happen to them at this point in their life. And, you know, the news again has been littered with case studies of people who, you know, previously were running ultra marathons who are now struggling to get downstairs. And your heart goes out to those people who say absolutely no fault of their own are living a completely different life to the one that they were 6 months ago or whatever. And my concern is for some of around the role of carers within that. And I've done some research work about carers and their needs when caring for somebody towards the end of their life. And one of the most stark quotes that I came across was, actually, I wish I was treated as taking somebody to hospital for an outpatient's appointment. I wish I was treated as somebody more than the person who drove them here in the car. So that kind of absolute expertise that carers have, and I use that term very broadly, but the people alongside the person with the condition, and their expertise at working together very often to best manage a condition and to make the best of life, to ensure that together they can have the best life that they can, despite whatever the hand that has been dealt. But actually that when that isn't then acknowledged, and actually there, and you talked about, you know, that split between informal and formal care, actually in a way they're the ones who have their greatest degree of understanding alongside the person with the condition about that condition and how that needs to be recognized and not dismissed. But time and time again it came out that it was dismissed, and, you know, that wasn't recognized, that role just wasn't recognized, despite the fact that if that role wasn't there, the healthcare system would be on its knees, without doubt. And, you know, also the kind of the growing concerns of, I've talked a little bit about the excess death rate. So for those who are not familiar with that, that's the death rate over and above what we would normally see as a 5-year average that's happened over the last year. It's been much talked about kind of on the news. And where we've had peaks in excess death rates, both in hospitals and in care homes, and much advertised through the waves, what's actually happened is that there's been an enduring excess death rate at home throughout. So not in a peak and trough so much, but actually throughout. So what was the care, what we don't know is what those caring experiences were like for those individuals and how that's now going to impact on into bereavement. And it's a really interesting area, I think, because one of the big policy pushes has been death at home equals good death, or death in preferred place of care, which is commonly perceived to be home is good death. And we know that that isn't always necessarily the case, and it's multifactorial as to whether or not that would be the case, that that would be a good death. So what we don't know is actually what those caring experiences were like for those individuals caring for people at home who then died at home, and what impact that will have going forward, because we do know that how somebody dies lives on in the memory of those who survive them, and then it can impact on bereavement. So there's a very complex picture, I think, that is going to emerge around caring. And there's almost another book, Madeleine, to be written, I think, that reflects what's happened during the pandemic, because this is of a time, and I think you wrote it, the introduction, that kind of the proofs came through as we were locking down, kind of thing, and to read those stories about what caring was then. And actually, I think people's experiences of not being able to visit, not being able, you've talked of touch, the important, and the impact of that both on healthcare professionals, of not being able to care in the way that they usually did, and for informal carers, for want of any other term, but family members, those close to those individuals, not being able to visit, not being able to touch, not being able to visit care homes, or visiting only allowed at the very end of life, what the impact of that is going to be as we move forward. And I think it's an absolutely fascinating topic of what is the crisis of care that occurred during the pandemic, and what was its impact?
Yeah, I mean, I think what the pandemic did is expose that, all of the kind of the whole kind of, it's a bit like one of those stains that you put onto a slide to be able to sort of analyze through a microscope. That somehow COVID has thrown into very sharp relief many of the kind of dimensions of care and how we've understood it, and the sort of the kind of that it's absolute care is a kind of essential network for all of us, a kind of safety net. It's what sustains us. And as you say, that the kind of lack of being able to touch, I mean, the very moving 2 books by COVID that I reviewed for The Guardian, and working in COVID, one by Gavin Francis and another by the intensive by a hospice doctor, Rachel
Clark. Yeah.
Rachel Clark.
Yeah.
And Rachel Clark, there was this just very memorable sentence where she said, the people coming into the intensive care unit would not see another human face without a mask before they died. And I just can't imagine what that must have been like, and desperately distressing for the staff involved to realize that that hunger for human connection was just not possible.
Yeah, and almost in a way, your armory of care is taken away from you, that actually touch, smile,
and expression. That's right.
Expression, and being alongside somebody, but not with an entire barrier between you and them because of what they had. It just is. It's still, I think, unraveling, will continue to unravel, and how that stays on with people, I think, will be be fascinating to see. But certainly thinking of the local hospice here in York, talking to the staff there, actually not being able to allow visitors in, and actually saying no. It just goes against everything that you were trained to do as a hospice nurse or a hospice practitioner. And that is stressful. That is really difficult, to actually have to be a gatekeeper of a patient in such a way, because of restrictions. And I think looking at how that then impacts on, well, partly the kind of the role then that healthcare professionals took in the absence of families, and their role in trying to connect them up electronically, but also those stories, I think, particularly that came out of ICU, of, you know, we will be there and we will hold their hand, and I was the one who was there when they died because you couldn't be, I think is it's one of the most profound things that people will have gone through. And certainly as a hospice nurse, you know, it's one of the greatest privileges to be alongside somebody when they die. And it used to amaze me sometimes that actually, you know, somebody may be 85 years old and I might be the last person that was alongside. In that 85 years, all the people that they met, you know, the privilege of being the last person in their life alongside them when family couldn't be there or there weren't family to be there is just phenomenal. But when people were doing that to the extent that they were, you do wonder about that impact on them going forward, for sure. So just kind of moving us from that, there was an opportunity for people to email questions in if we wanted. We unfortunately weren't able to do this live, and so we can't have that natural kind of conversation that we might have had of questions coming in from an audience. And hopefully one day, Madeleine, we will be able to meet in person. So one of the questions that came in, and I think it kind of refers a little bit back to some of the kind of more policy government stuff that we've talked about already, is about actually our approach to care and our organisation of care. And the question that was posed was about whether or not moving to salaried NHS community doctors rather than this kind of organisation of care of private GP practices help improve a joined up approach to care in our communities. And that's obviously quite a big question around the organisation of the NHS. And just reflecting on, you know, the fact that you interviewed GPs in the book and they came across such humble people and so keen to do the very best for their patients. Do you think that a move to a different form of kind of organisation may help, or do you think it's kind of okay as it is?
Oh God, these are huge questions.
Yeah.
I'm afraid I didn't really, I didn't see the book as a book about health policy. I was asking a much more kind of broad-ranging question, really, about human beings and an aspect of their relationship with each other, which is this aspect of care. And the professionalization of that care was just one small part of a bigger picture. So I did inevitably sort of bump into all sorts of policy debates. I mean, I was very, very interested in the sort of growth of a profit motive in healthcare. I think that has a big impact on the nature of the relationships that are then possible within those organizations if they're profit orientated. So I was interested around that kind of element of profit, particularly in the care industry. I think it's absolutely outrageous and scandalous what's happened in our care sector for the residential and nursing care. And that was the area of policy that I probably did the most research on, because I thought it was, you know, but I still, you know, I didn't see the book as getting into that incredibly complicated and extremely important big debate about healthcare, how to organise the NHS, how to ensure best value for money without cutting corners that end up compromising the quality of care. You know, these are the big debates we've been having for 30 odd years. And I, you know, I only picked up certain elements that I thought were really important for this issue of care, thinking about care. So on that particular question you're asking, it's sort of one that I think is sort of a bit above my pay grade. There were definitely issues that the GPs raised with me about the way the NHS, the sort of pressures on them, which were compromising, they felt, their understanding of care. Their particular concern, and it was a very, very big issue for them, was continuity. So they believed continuity was essential, and therefore the kind of agenda of 24/7 sort of, well, not quite 24, but, you know, 7-day working, for example, of being able to have walk-in clinics. They said this is just, you know, an irrelevance actually for most of our patients who are predominantly elderly and predominantly, you know, they're prepared to wait for an appointment because they want the continuity of relationship. You know, they made the point that healthcare policy tends to be made by men in their 40s, 30s, 40s, 50s, who often have no history of ill health, and therefore don't actually understand what most of the NHS is doing, because they have had very, very little limited exposure to it. You know, the most that they've had to have was, you know, maybe some problem with their big toe, so they had to go in for an outpatient appointment. And I thought that was a really good point, actually. And, you know, I'm very fortunate. I fall into the category of having had very, very little exposure to the NHS. You know, I'm not one of those people who've had a lot of healthcare, apart from babies in hospital. That's my only time I've been in hospital. So the whole thing of writing this book was such a steep learning curve, kind of thinking, actually, what do doctors and nurses, most of them, what are they doing? And of course, you know, at every turn, I was learning absolutely masses. But all the time, you know, what I kept on bringing, there was a sort of discipline, a kind of boundary nature to the book, which is to keep on bringing it back to care. And to think about the ways in which different professions had an understanding of care and what that entailed. And, you know, we talked briefly at the beginning about this idea in which some of the tasks that a nurse would have done have now moved to a healthcare assistant. And the nurse is now much more screen-based. I mean, it was very, very striking how watching the nurses on the ward, how much time they spent on screens, and how that was not something they really enjoyed particularly. But they are now coordinating so many complex tests and diagnostic procedures, that it's, you know, the job is much more of a sort of management type job. And of course, that's the language that gets used. They're managing the patient journey was one phrase that somebody used to me. And, you know, I was like, what? You know, until they explained it. And then I can see it. But it means is, you know, so easy for them to forget that, you know, to find the time to walk across the ward, to actually talk to the person whose tests they're chasing on screen. You know, it does become inevitably disconnected. And so the impact of technology on healthcare, I think, has been really, really significant. You know, if you think 100 years ago, you know, Florence Nightingale's time, well, they didn't have much medical care to offer, you know, apart from keeping people clean, and try and persuade them to eat a little bit. You know, it didn't really go much beyond that because there was so little they could do. Now there is so much we can do. And that can sometimes mean that the sort of just having time to sort of just, you know, talk to somebody can actually be very, very challenging. And the director of nursing of the hospital where I did the shadowing on the ward admitted to me, she said, you know, it's a cause of great concern for me. You know, when I was training, I remember occasions when, you know, I gave a patient a hug, or I stayed with them all night because they were scared and they were approaching their death. I can't imagine now how any of my nurses could do those sorts of things. And it does worry me. She said, once I was walking into the ward and there was a nurse sitting on the side of the bed chatting to someone. She jumps up, so nervous. Oh, I'm sorry. I am really, really busy, I promise. You know, it's like she had to apologize for talking to the patient. And it's, again, that sort of dualism that again and again nursing kind of struggles with, which is, you know, the idea that we want technically really skilled, really clinically expert nursing. Of course we want that. But at the same time, we want nurses that have got the time and emotional empathy and patience to engage with the person. Now, it is possible to do both. And that's the tricky thing. You know, training people to do both, you know, it really it's enormously important. I mean, I watched the nurse doing it, so I saw her doing it. I'd obviously been assigned a really superb nurse to shadow, and she had worked before she went into nursing. She had worked in retail, and people said to her, "You're very kind. Why don't you go into nursing?" And so she started as a healthcare assistant and had worked her way up. And it was, the only way I can describe it was that it was like she was doing a sort of dance. She would check the screen back to the person. She was constantly moving. I mean, 12-hour shifts in which she barely had time to have a proper drink or sit down. I mean, I don't know what her stamina, it was just phenomenal, kind of physical strength she required. But it was extraordinarily skilled, the way she was managing to keep all sorts of elements in the care of all sorts of patients sort of on her radar. It was like she was playing with them, is kind of juggling. You know, it was really, really astonishing. Funnily enough, one nurse that I interviewed had been an air traffic control controller, and And he said, you know, actually, there's not that much difference. You know, you have to keep on checking. You've got lots of moving parts, and you've got to remember where they are in sort of 3D space. And you've got to keep all of this in your mind in constant flux. It was an amazing metaphor. Really, really incredible.
And I think absolutely sums up the skill of care.
I think it does, yeah.
And the compassion that's required with it too. And maybe we need to advertise more for more ex-air traffic controllers to come into nursing. And on that note, I would just like to thank you, Madeleine. It's been an absolutely fascinating hour with you. It's quite indulgent for me to be able to sit and chat about such things for an hour. So thank you so much for giving us your time today. And just to say that the recording of this event will be available on the festival YouTube channel, which can be accessed from the Watch Again section of the festival website. And if you'd like to purchase a copy of Madeleine's book, Labour of Love, which is here, it's available from the partner bookseller, which is Fox Lane Books. And for more information on book sales, please see the festival website, which will be linked from the presentation today. So again, Madeleine, thank you very much. I've so enjoyed our conversation. Thank you.